gospel reading comes from Matthew chapter 5 and can be found on page 4 of the New Testament portion of your pew Bible. Listen now for God's word. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, where it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, until your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law, and whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Happy Sunday. Welcome to church. Pretty scary stuff, huh? Yes, it does indeed sound like Jesus is saying that when it comes to getting into heaven, it doesn't matter whether you are a murderer or whether you had a beer on Sunday or whether you told your friend that she did look good in that outfit. It doesn't matter in God's eyes. You're still not worthy. And traditionally, in Protestant theology, Matthew 5:18 is the reason we say that the Old Testament law in still some way applies to us. But what's key, we say, is that since it is humanly impossible to keep it, to abide by that law, therefore we need the grace of Jesus Christ and the forgiveness of God offered in him in order to be saved. However, I don't think that is exactly what Jesus is trying to get at here. You see, Jesus' whole ministry as a teacher of the law, that's what he was, as a rabbi, was really devoted to answering the question, how do we interpret the Torah, the law, and apply it to our lives? You see, it was the job of rabbis to interpret the Torah. Which of the laws, which of the commandments were the greatest, the most important, and which were the least? Because they often bumped up against each other. And so throughout Jesus' life and ministry, throughout the Gospels, we get examples of the way different laws or commandments would rub up against each other, would conflict with each other. The classic example, of course, is it's Saturday, meaning it's the Sabbath for Jews, and you see a man who is bleeding on the street. And on the one hand, you're supposed to love your neighbor, and on the other hand, well, you would be ritually impure if you touched blood, and wouldn't helping that man be working on the Sabbath and breaking the Sabbath? So what are you supposed to do? And so Jesus' whole ministry was helping people make sense of those commandments, ordering them. You might recall that that was a question that Jesus got asked, right? Which of these commandments is the greatest? And he answered that the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart and strength and soul. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And that was really the kicker, because a lot of rabbis said that that text from Deuteronomy, to love God with all your heart, strength, and soul, that was the number one commandment, but the second being like it. Well, shouldn't the Sabbath be the second? No, loving your neighbor as yourself. And so Jesus' whole ministry, his whole life was devoted to teaching that, was devoted to illustrating that. The entire Sermon on the Mount, for which this forms the introduction, is really an explanation of what it looks like to love God by loving one's neighbor. But Jesus actually illustrated it in his own life, the way that he touched lepers and hung out with pagans, and he saw prostitutes and murderers as made in God's image. And mainly, he did it just by being who he was. Jesus illustrated the way that loving one's neighbor is like loving God by being God, by literally being God as a human, God and neighbor, and ultimately not conquering his enemies with angel armies, but letting them execute him as a criminal, which, of course, is absolutely insane. And so this radical way in which Jesus interprets the law and directs people how to love God and to be a follower, it feels like he is starting a new religion, throwing out the law, when in fact he was just showing us how God intends for the law to be completely followed. That the law makes much more sense when it is interpreted in view of the rule of love. The problem, of course, is what happened to Jesus. The problem is when you do your job as one of Jesus' followers, as loving God and loving your neighbor more than you love religion or your tribe or your political party, you are going to be slandered. You might be attacked. You might be beat up. That's what it means to be salt and light. That's what all those "blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are you when you are persecuted" sayings are about. Because don't let it scare you. God still calls you loved. God still calls you blessed. The work you are doing is blessing the world, is healing the world. That's what it means to be salt and light. That those who follow Jesus are supposed to be a peculiar people, a blessing for the whole world. And so where are the places today where we can be salt and light? I confess that I had a lot of trouble writing this sermon today and writing this sermon this week. And some of y'all have figured out by now that like whenever he goes down to the floor, it's going to be like some sort of scary sermon sometimes. Because it was a scary week. It was a really hard week for us as a nation. I know looking through my whole Facebook news feed was just filled more than usual with people with indignant, righteous anger. A world that needs salt and light. And so what I'm going to read now, and it's kind of long, is an article that I found from a website called preemptivelove.com called The Illusion Is Gone. And I'm going to sort of make the apology that I frequently make whenever I am talking about current events or politics, because I know we don't really come to church to sort of talk about politics. The joke that I think is a really good joke about it is that mixing religion and politics is kind of like mixing ice cream with manure. It doesn't do much to the manure, but it sure messes up the ice cream. So I'm going to make that sort of caveat before I read this. But the reason why we go there in church is because the gospel is political, and because we are shaped by that. And to ignore when things in current events are happening would be to say that the gospel only applies to us on an hour on Sunday. So let me read this article. The illusion is gone. Tearing up President Trump's speech may have been the most honest thing Speaker Pelosi could have done. Refusing to shake Speaker Pelosi's hand, assuming it was an intentional snub, may have been the most honest thing President Trump could have done. We are finally able to see ourselves as we are. For years, the State of the Union and other moments of political pomp and ceremony projected at least the illusion of civility, a carefully choreographed image of a country rising above partisanship for the sake of common cause, or at least common courtesy. There were occasional cracks in the edifice, like the time a congressman shouted, "You lie," during a speech by then President Obama, but for the most part, the illusion held. Decorum was maintained, the edifice preserved. During this year's State of the Union, there was no such illusion. The customary pretense of civility gave way to what was, if nothing else, a more honest reflection back to us of who we are and of how deeply divided we are. We're not going to offer any hot takes on whether ripping up the speech was a bold act of political defiance or a petty display of partisanship. Both perspectives are held by members of our team and our wider community. We are not unlike the divided nation many of us belong to. But what the State of the Union made painfully clear is that we cannot escape or ignore our current situation. Yes, we really are this divided. Yes, 2020 is going to be as polarizing as many of us fear. So what are we going to do about it? We can hunker down in our echo chambers, listen only to those who agree with us, cheer as the pundit class and Twitterati tear each other apart, not realizing that by isolating ourselves from and dehumanizing those we disagree with, we are slowly corroding our own hearts. We can check out, turn off CNN or Fox News, and binge watch Netflix instead. And sometimes we should unplug. I have been doing lots of unplugging recently. But escapism is not a long-term strategy for healing what tears us apart. We can stay silent, refuse to engage, declare that politics really isn't our thing, hoping that somehow this time neutrality will be the answer it's never managed to be to the most pressing issues of our day. Or we can show up. We can seek out those who see the world differently than we do. Not to pretend our differences don't exist or don't matter, but to pursue understanding, to pursue relationship anyway. We can choose to relentlessly humanize everyone. Hold space for everyone. We can refuse to let exclusionary partisanship or superficial civility be our only options. We can choose something better, something that might offer a way through. This year will clearly be a year of division and polarization. The question is, will this also be the year that we start writing a counter story? There will be plenty of opportunities to divide this year. But there is also a way to draw closer to each other in the year ahead. We can gather in our neighborhoods with that person, not to pretend everything is fine, and not to symbolically tear each other apart, but to listen to each other, learn from each other, and pursue peace through relationship and action. Now that the illusion is gone, now that our divisions are laid bare, the real work of peacemaking can begin. But it won't start until you do. And that's basically what I've got for y'all this morning. In other words, how are we going to be salt and light? How are we going to explode and transcend the tribes and parties and boundaries that all too often the church is instead one of the first institutions to cheerlead for and reinforce and promote? That's one of the reasons why I am so excited about the possibility of Westminster being a neighborhood church. So many folks who have come to Westminster or who have visited our church have come because it is the church in their neighborhood. It is the church that is the closest one nearby, and they want to know their neighbors. And believe me, their neighbors cheer for the blue team, and their neighbors cheer for the red team. And their neighbors participate in those same echo chambers with like-minded friends online and on TV that they do, that we do. But church has the possibility of being someplace different. It has the possibility of being a place where those lines are exploded and where we follow the model of Christ, who showed exactly what it means to love even enemies. We talked about this in the Sunday school class this morning on the Sermon on the Mount, that it really does feel impossible. But that doesn't mean that we give up trying. That doesn't mean that we are too foolish to try. Because we believe in a God who blesses us and over and over and over again says, "You are beloved. You are blessed." So not just today, not just this week, I hope that you will go out from this place and seek to be a salty person, not in the wrong way, but in the way of love, in the way that this world desperately, desperately needs, in the way that it doesn't say Jesus invites, it says Jesus commands. It's all that easy, and it's all that hard. Glory be to God the Father, and God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Amen.